And it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Vera Keller. In January of 2018, Dr. Keller gave a talk here titled The Baroque Science of Color, and that was in relationship to an exhibition curated by Professor James Harper here on the Barberini tapestries, woven monuments of Baroque Rome. And perhaps some of you who attended her talk had the same feeling I did. I didn't want it to end. And I was like, I want more Vera Keller. So when she called me to see if she could share her recent research as a 2018-2019 Oregon Humanities Center Fellow, I was delighted because I wanted to hear from her again. She's going to share with us her recent research on cabinets of curiosities and the origin of museums. And I started thinking about, quote unquote, cabinets of curiosities that we've shown recently here at the museum. Some things in our collection, some things on loan. Most recently, Mark Dion's Institute for Invertebrate Marine Biology, which was featured in the Plastic Entanglements exhibition last fall. Dr. Keller received her PhD from Princeton University in 2008, and she came to teach at University of Oregon in 2010 as an assistant professor of history and then as an associate professor of history at the Robert D. Clark Honors College. And last year, she became the associate professor of history in the history department at UO. And I'm just going to mention a few of her recent accomplishments because there were dozens listed on her CV, so many of these are just from the last few years. She's the author of the monograph Knowledge and the Public Interest, 1575 to 1725, published in 2015 by Cambridge University Press. And she's also an editor and author for the recent publication Archival Afterlives, Life, Death, and Knowledge, Making in Early Modern British Scientific and Medical Archives. That was published in 2018. And she's authored a chapter in the forthcoming book, Institutionalization of Science in Early Modern Europe. She curated the exhibition, The Global History of Color, at UO's Museum of Natural and Cultural History in the spring of 2018 and has collaboratively curated exhibitions with UO's Knight Library, Special Collections, and University Archives, and the Kellenberger Library at Northwest Christian University. Her recent awards, distinctions, and fellowships include a faculty grant from UO's Digital Scholarship Center, which resulted in a digital humanities project, and you're all welcome to pick up these wonderful bookmarks. And visit redthread.uoregon.edu, which grew out of a course that Dr. Keller taught on the global history of color. 2018-2019, she received a UO Faculty Fund for Excellence Award, and she was selected to participate in UO's Leadership Academy. And her maybe latest really big project is as a co-investigator of collective wisdom, collecting in the Early Modern Academy. There has been one, maybe future, two, okay, and another international workshop funded by a networking grant. And she and other scholars are exploring how and why members of the Royal Society, the Society of Antiquaries of London, and the Leopoldina in Germany collected specimens of the natural world, art, and archaeology in the 17th and 18th centuries. So that's at collectivewisdom.uoregon.edu. You can learn about that project. And to put a plug in for an upcoming international conference she's organizing on the Kunstkammer, that will be June 4th through 5th, 2020 here at UOregon, University of Oregon. So her talk tonight is Playfulness from the Cabinet of Curiosities to the Origin of Museums. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vera Keller.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Oregon Humanities Center Fellowships for giving me this time this term free from teaching so I can do this research. It's part of our duties as a fellow to give a public address about our research, so that's what this is. And thank you so much to Cheryl and to the museum for hosting it so generously. And this is part of this monograph that I'm currently writing, and also part of the larger research project that Cheryl mentioned, Collective Wisdom. And both this research group as a whole and my book in particular are asking one large question: how did a culture of curiosity become one of research around 1700? That's our kind of big overarching takeaway question. And in particular, we're looking at that through the history of collecting, through museums, and looking at one major transition that obviously happened. In history of science, we're very careful about teleology, about from to, of saying things always went and developed in a modern way, in a very linear way. But this is a case where you look at a curiosity cabinet in the 16th century and a museum in the 18th century. There is a transition. Everyone recognizes that there's a transition. How it happened, though, we still don't know. It's a kind of still a big question in the history of collecting. So that's what I'm looking at in particular. Typically, this story, this transition, is a story that's told about a death of playfulness and a turn towards the seriousness, towards the serious. So, for instance, Julius von Schlosser, who inaugurated the study of cabinets of curiosities in 1908, spoke of the replacement of, quote, courtly galleries of an older time with the, quote, pedantic proficience, the business-like seriousness of Prussian pedagogues. So this business-like seriousness, that's the story of how this change occurred. We had Prussian pedagogues coming in and transforming the previous wonderful, whimsical culture of curiosity collecting. He was referring to the centrality of the museums within the 19th century German research university, particularly in Berlin, a phenomenon recently explored by M. Norton Wise. Museums were integral to the core mission and research practices of research institutions, upon which many of the American research universities were based, particularly in the sciences. So if you've ever encountered the idea that museum collections are not a part of the core mission of the universities, history is not on your side. So one finding of my own research, confirmed by others in the Collective Wisdom Project, is that playfulness did not, in fact, die at this transition into the new research institution. It shifted and it changed. And following that history of playfulness, therefore, is one way to uncover what the dynamics were, first shaping curiosity and then transforming it into this culture of research, particularly in an academic context. So first today, I will set the stage by talking about playfulness within the cabinets of curiosity tradition. What functions did it then serve? How did it relate to curiosity? I'll point to two uses, one a philosophical or epistemic one, and the other a social one, that allowed a culture of curiosity to flourish via a mode of playfulness. Then I will turn to the new ways playfulness appeared in research-oriented academic museums, in the innovative but often ignored practices of Johann Daniel Major, the first chair of medicine in the newly founded University of Kiel of 1666, and someone who considered himself, on good grounds, to be the first museologist. Finally, in concluding, I will note how this history problematizes the current curatorial trend for reviving the cabinet of curiosities in contemporary museum exhibitions. So first, why playfulness? And this, perforce, is going to be a hasty sketch. We have to start by establishing that in pre-modern Europe, the social hierarchy mapped onto a natural hierarchy, since at least classical Greece. At the top, you have the heavens, a realm of predictability and certainty. At the bottom lay the earth, the realm of the four elements, each representing a different passion and each struggling with and changing one another. On a cosmic level, the lowest level of the earth, particularly the subterranean realm, was a zone of constant change, of fertile, even erotic productivity and metamorphosis, not analyzable by reason. Superimposed on this cosmic system, we have a human hierarchy, with the heavens at the level of the rational mind, with which theologians and philosophers like to equate themselves. Moving down the body, we have a zone of the heart, a more animated but still noble area, a place of courage and close communication with the brain. And lower still were the stomach and the sexual organs, realms of unmitigated desire and unrestrained action, that of the common people, lacking both intellect and nobility. That was the realm of curiosity, not associated in pre-modern Europe with scientia or science, but with the senses, and particularly with the desire to peer where one should not, especially in an erotic way. And so this is nicely schematized for us by this handy reference work, Cesare Ripa's Iconologia, which takes different ideas and renders it in visual form. So on the right, we have Scientia, who has wings on her head to elevate her to the heavenly realms. She's engaged in abstraction and studying geometric shapes, things that are regular and predictable. Very much on contrast to that, we have Curiosity, who does have wings, but her wings are down in her bodily realm. Her dress has her eyes and her ears as she's using her senses to fly around the world, investigating this terrestrial level where she really should not be prying into secrets. Her hair is notoriously much more similar to my hair than Scienza's coiffure there. So this is a view of curiosity as frenzied, as uncontrollable, not at all the kind of scientific virtue that we associate with curiosity today. Curiosity was something you tried to keep out of Scientia, of science. And so that change, that rise in the level of curiosity is something that many historians have studied before. And it is fundamental to reshaping Scientia, or science, into the experimental science that we know today. That was because in the past, Scientia referred to immaterial, intellectually abstract, stable universals, whereas frenzied curiosity was the way that we experience the world through our senses. The elevated realm was that of reason and philosophy, the lower that of emotion. In literature and art, the upper belonged to the histories of the gods and of kings, the lower to comedy, fools, and the purposefully irrational. And the emergence of the aesthetic of the grotesque, associated with the metamorphic realm of underground grottos in the early 16th century, showed a place where nature was particularly known to hide and to play, randomly producing oddities and monsters called jokes or sports of nature, just as we still call them sports today. If you have an unusual growth, you might call it a sport. So this bifurcation between the realm of science, the abstract, the universal, not accessed through your senses, but rather through reason, and curiosity, the realm of change and metamorphosis, the realm of the senses, pose a huge challenge to the emergence of modern science because it is based in sense perception and material investigations through experiment. All these were the opposite of Scientia, of science, at the time. All these were associated with the common folk, with charlatans, or so-called empirics, traveling hucksters, magicians, and popular entertainment. Woe betide anyone with pretensions to be a philosopher from the realm of the mind, or a nobleman from the realm of the heart, from getting involved in the zone of the stomach and the genitals. Champions of empirical approaches to nature had to work in a grotesque mode. A prime example of that is the grotto builder Bernard de Palissy, who had an innovative research collection open to the public in Paris, but intervened in underground processes using live castings of lowly creatures such as frogs and snakes and experimentation in ceramics in order to learn about the natural processes such as petrifaction and the growth of stones. Empiricism and experimentation would stay at the fringes and never take over Scientia, as it has, without rising socially. And there was one trend among the nobility that offered it a way in. This was the model of the Ideal Courtier, publicized by Baldassare Castiglione, who thought that the erstwhile feudal military nobility ought to seek more learned roles. It was important, however, that they not do so in a pedantic mode. Association with academics was more damaging to one's reputation than hobnobbing with grotto builders. Castiglione identified a particular way of noble engagement with learning, sprezzatura, or disdain, an effortless, off-the-cuff approach, claiming that one wasn't really taking anything too seriously. This sprezzatura intersected with playfulness and empiricism, offering a vector of empirical study into elite society, yet always maintaining that playful mode. So in courtly collections of curiosity, one finds the nobility eager to show that they really weren't engaging with nature in a professional way, in a serious way, with many references to folk humor and to gestures. Of course, this isn't a folk object. It has an exotic coconut, it has gold, it has silver, but we have these references to kind of vernacular humor in many objects from curiosity cabinets of the period. It was because of this comedic requirement that, for instance, the origins of still life painting or independent picturing of the natural world could only take place, as Thomas da Costa Kaufmann has shown, in the funny faces painted by Giuseppe Arcimboldo. So here we have this basket of fruits. It's an independent still life painting, one of the first, Kaufmann argues, which you turn it over and you get the joke. The joke is the face hidden within it. Arcimboldo was one of a number of artists associated with the greatest collector of the period, perhaps ever, Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II of Prague. And he paid Rudolf the compliment of representing him as one of his comedic assemblages of realistically painted fruits and flowers. So this noble, even imperial adoption of the culture of curiosity wasn't supposed to render the emperor merely funny, but to showcase his sprezzatura, or disdain. Indeed, the nature of playfulness at court was cruel and aggressive. Visiting a noble collection could be a very intimidating experience, as you knew that the collection was bent on playing tricks on you. Imagine coming face to face with this portrait in Rudolph's collection. You're put on the spot. What reaction would be appropriate? What might the political consequences be? And there were all sorts of other ways that the collection's playfulness targeted the visitor. You might be shot with arrows by a tiny automated Diana. You might encounter strange, terrifying creatures, unidentifiable jokes of nature, or animals brought from around the world. Sometimes the boundaries between the real and the artificial were purposely obscure, as nature was shown to be an artist, or as art masqueraded as nature. And this is a view of Rudolf II's palace in Prague, rendered in marbles. To dramatize how aggressive the collection could be, I'll play a clip showing one of the many automata probably animating Rudolph's collection. So this is from 1587, and it's believed to have been in Rudolph's collection. It's a little under 2 minutes long. It's worth watching until the end. We tested this before. There we go. Perhaps for eagles. So I wasn't joking when I said that the collection could get aggressive with you. In the realm of philosophy, an interest in monsters and rarities, as historians of science Lorraine Daston and Katie Park have noted, enjoyed a heyday from the mid-16th century as a way to query and overthrow abstract, systematic explanations of nature. Yet at last, in the early 17th century, as social status elevated curiosity, empiricism, and experimentalism, the study of nature through the senses could finally become highbrow. Slowly, this culture of curiosity began to enter pedagogy, particularly in schools, such as those run by Jesuits, aimed at socially elite audiences. They offered, beginning in the 1620s, fun mathematical recreations and experiments, the origins of all those whiz-bang demonstrations one might find today in physics or chemistry lectures, or puzzles and games used to teach math. The Jesuits, such as Athanasius Kircher in Rome, specialized in this, offering wonderful grottos, automata, and to their eyes, playful devices, such as the yowling cat piano of Kircher's student Gaspar Schott. Protestant pedagogues aimed to compete with the Jesuits, ushering in new, playful, hands-on, curious forms of instruction. My current book project looks at the reshaping of the collection into a pedagogical and research museum in the hands of Johann Daniel Mayer. The first, he says, to establish the science museum display as an independent discipline. His aim was to move the collection away from noble values and towards academic research via experimentation. And today I'm going to focus on a very narrow slice of his museum reforms, which were fairly global, the new place of play. In 1670, he detailed the curriculum of his private course in medicine, taught as was usual at the time in his own home, using, as was not usual, objects from his own collection. As he wrote, the highlight of his medical course was how he would take out of his cabinets now this object, now that, in no particular order. First, he would observe the object. Then he would subject it to some sort of demonstration or experimentation. And then in an impromptu flowing discourse, he would immediately derive medical lessons from it. This is a showcase of pedagogical sprezzatura. Among the many impediments to experimentation, he pointed out, was the difficulty in accessing global natural objects for study. This seemed to be solved by the many priceless, mostly princely collections. Yet among all these, what visitor to a stranger's collection could expect to touch, break, handle, and seize even an atom from something precious with its owner being unwilling? If objects were only for display, they could not serve experimentalism. His own collection would be different. There, the various parts of nature would be available for students and interested members of the public to taste, smell, weigh, break, melt, harden, soften, form, and mix, place under the microscope, examine through fire, dissect, shape, and transform in many ways, and to compare with what authors have written in text or shown in images. He uses 19 verbs here for all the ways his students would be welcome to destroy objects for the purposes of research. This new hands-on experience meant designing boxes, signage, and cabinets that would make objects not just visible but easily retrievable, built by the experimentalist himself in ways that made the material within grasp physically and conceptually. So while Mayer demanded extreme order, separation, and clarity in the categorization of objects and in their placement within boxes and signage, his manipulation of those objects remained playfully haphazard. He wanted his teaching to be fun. Experiments delighted the senses, and he's really trying to bring the senses to bear upon scientia here. That's this early modern transformation in the meaning of science. He listed many experiments, such as chemical color changes or the explosion of gunpowder that could engage his students. But importantly, students were not passive observers, much less victims of such explosions as they might have been in a princely collection. It was through their own interventions that museum objects came alive. In Meyer's museum, playfulness was removed from the objects and bestowed upon the human experimenter. So for example, in his medical course, his curious medical course he calls it, he takes us through the collection, shows us how he's using it. And emphasizing this rabbit out of a hat pedagogy, he often describes the act of taking an object out of a cabinet in the first person, as in, quote, "Out of my cabinets I showed 2 whales' penises, one of 4 feet, the other of 6.5 feet in length." This wasn't just showmanship, for Meyer claimed to always link the object back to medical use, but one can only imagine. Meyer based his pedagogy on a belief in the universal human impulse towards natural study, which could be cultivated through proper museum design and made the basis of an experiential education. He opened his 1674 unprecedented thoughts concerning chambers of art and nature in general with a chapter on the natural attraction of every human to the study of nature, and he really meant every human globally. This led him to attempt to establish a state-of-the-art by surveying, collecting, and display practices worldwide in a series of publications. He discusses, for example, Montezuma's collection of human oddities, referring to the account of Cortez, who described, next to Montezuma's collection of animals and birds, quote, another house where many monstrous men and women lived. Among them were dwarfs, hunchbacks, and deformed, and each manner of monster had a room apart, and they also had persons to take charge of them. Meyer queries whether Montezuma was right to include dwarves and deformed creatures, not out of a concern for human rights, so much as for the aesthetic of the collection. He said that he had two reasons for this question. First, shouldn't one seek to show the most perfect examples of nature in a collection? And secondly, the miserable deformities tended to attract the eye strongly to it, disrupting with their pathos the aesthetic experience of the collection as a whole, which should lend an overall impression of, quote, neatness and ornament. Of course, monsters were the bread and butter of the contemporary European cabinet of curiosities, which perhaps, when it came to his own local political patron, the Duke of Gottorp, he couldn't so easily criticize. So we can see here how Meyer has displaced a local critique abroad by seeing it in the collection of Montezuma. Another tactic Meyer used was to showcase sports of nature himself, but then to dramatize a new way to consider them, to kind of exorcise a particular form of playfulness and replace it with something else. He did this often. And I'm going to look at one example from when he finally opened his public museum, which he did in 1688. It was called the Museum Simbricum in the main area of Kiel in northern Germany. And this was a tiny, tiny space. So I owe this diagram to the city of Kiel, who has it up on their website. They're very proud of this. They're the only people who know about it. It fits only about 6 people at most. And Meyer, who was busy digging up prehistoric burial sites at the time, described this as, quote, a cosmosophic or philosophical tomb or hoard. He offered several reasons for describing this collection as a grave. One was the possible negative response of the viewer, used to a very different sort of collection, who, seeing the closed doors of the few cabinets filled with small items and the simple architecture, might think of the space as, quote, a tomb-shaped showplace of loneliness and the true residence of need, lack, and simplicity. The funereal atmosphere might well be increased by the 8-foot-tall coffin-sized cabinets that lined the walls. And this is a strikingly different aesthetic from the in-your-face Kunst und Wunderkammer designs of the time. Everything is shut away, as we see in this model. Meyer states that this was a conscious departure from the norm. According to the poor practices of almost all other collections, he wrote, the eye becomes confused through the display of far too many figures and bodies. One of the purposes of cabinetization was to limit the visual field, allowing for the precise attention to particular objects demanded by experimentation. Between the cabinets, he designed a simple architectural wall decoration, quote, in order to allow the eye to rest. Yet, should the curator wish it, the cabinets were designed so that their shelves could all swivel obliquely to face a single perspective, thus allowing the observer's eye to rake across the room. If you opened all the cabinet doors at once, you could, quote, arrange a merry parade of nearly 1,000 things within a single view. What was enclosed in this philosophical tomb was not the experimenter, but the object. With the object restrained, the experimenter was liberated, moving shelves, arranging views, drawing forth items, and making connections in a playful, impromptu way. We know a lot about how Meyer, in fact, did this for his audience, since he published all the details of the space as well as the public programming that he offered. So this is the second public visit to his museum, which took place on 27th of July in 1689. And his published account of a public visit shows him and his audience moving spontaneously from cabinet to cabinet, now exploring a piece of nature, subjecting a piece of red fruiting coral, the same specimen he had in his ideal case that we looked at before, to an experiment by burning and then weighing it, then inspecting a coin, comparing the coin to a carved jewel, looking up a question in a book, chatting with his audience about different authors. Then that conversation naturally led back to the cabinets and an exploration of some very playful parts of the marine world. fossils, and oddly figured stones. These were considered in the time to be painted by nature. Unusually, Meyer collected these locally on the beaches around Kiel. More often, you would try to seek them from abroad, an exotic painted stone. Documenting many of these objects and their positions in his museum in his research notes, which were part of a larger scale project on the archaeology, natural history, and prehistoric human settlement of the entire region. It was very innovative for the time. So through these notes, we can get a glimpse of what his public audience was seeing on his tour. They looked at stellar stones or star-shaped fossils, a stone that looked like a little mountain with a flag sticking up on its top, turtle stones that we see here, and many other things, a pebble with a number 9 on it, or another with the letter C, or the letter O, or with the shape of a heart. We've got 2 heart-shaped ones over here, or one with an entire cherry, including the stem and the leaf. So here, this is what he says looks like a cherry with a stem and a leaf. And he said he even had a carnelian that seemed to show the entire map of the galaxy in the Milky Way. So these are your typical playful curiosity cabinet objects where the boundaries between nature and art are somewhat obscured. Nature seems to be functioning as an artist here. How did these wonders arise? They're very curious oddities. But Meyer was quick to deflate the agency of nature in shaping these stones. As he wrote in his public program, quote, "Such images of things expressed by the hand of painter, nature, and stone are very apparent and do not require much intervention of the imagination in order to see them." However, he went on to say, these more obvious images might be of use for optical medical thought, for thinking about how things might penetrate more severely into our eyes, such as when we are suffering from seizures and see sparks, or we believe that we see shows upon a wall when we are delirious from fever, or how we see things in our sleep. Quote, "One might even discuss how it was that God showed himself to Moses on the Mount or to Paul in ecstasy and so forth. But prevented from this by other business, I was forced to break off." Here, Meyer pathologizes the figured stones, bringing them forth in order to purge them, making them part of medical disorders. He ventures onto very dangerous territory in attempting to link these museum objects to the mechanics of biblical vision, before, in the typically impromptu style he was advocating, abruptly ending his tour of the museum on this cliffhanger, inviting his readers to visit the museum again to continue the conversation the next Wednesday. Meyer, in his innovative transformation of the playfulness of the Cabinet of Curiosity, enjoys today nowhere near the renown of those of his contemporaries, such as the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, who today represents the apex of what Meyer was combating. Kircher has become an academic industry and a popular hit, giving rise, for example, to the Postmodern Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles. And although I'm going to be critiquing this move, I absolutely adore this museum, and you should all go visit when you get a chance. In general, this playful, illusionary, boundary-crossing, pre-modern chamber of art and wonder, or the Kunst- und Wunderkammer, has appealed to postmoderns as a way to escape the modern classificatory grip of the ordered museum, whose constructed objectivity has served as a means for naturalizing, among much else, colonialism and racism. Many have turned to reviving the playfulness of the Kunstkammer as a temporary release from the strictures of modern organization. So, as Cheryl mentioned, the contemporary artist Mark Dion has made a career crafting curiosity cabinet installations around the world, and I myself participated in one of his projects at the V&A. So this is some coverage of this phenomenon in The Guardian back in 2014. Why is it back in vogue? It's a macabre colonial throwback, asks Philip Hoare. We have some very problematic collections, such as the Ethnology Museum in Vienna, using their materials as a Wunderkammer. And then this is the project that I participated with, and you can check it out on the back table if you'd like. So David Martin, already back in 2011, criticized this trend for failing to be historically specific about the nature of early modern curiosity. As we have seen, curiosity collections of the prince were literally weaponized. They are not a refuge from modern power. Nothing is more the product of its time than humor. Once you find yourself chuckling at a joke from the distant past, you can finally rest assured that you have understood something about the time period. And early modern humor is far from our own today. In particular, playful returns to the curiosity cabinet of the past often fail to recognize the pre-modern or early modern violent, aggressive, and political uses of play. How is the liberty of the human observer restricted rather than cultivated by these aggressive spaces? I would ask, urged by Meyers' critique of them. Furthermore, this contemporary trend sets the playful cabinet against the backdrop of the serious museum, and yet playfulness has never disappeared within the organized collection. Rather, as Meyers' case illustrates, the jokes changed. Play gained new philosophical and social ends, and new forms of play served as key agents of reform. We might not find Meyer particularly funny either, but his attempts at museum humor are worth, well, humoring. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions you have.
We have a microphone here. Yeah, sure.
I think you may have touched on this very briefly, but I wanted to ask if Meyer had any real education regarding the curiosities that he was presenting to people, or was he simply pulling them out and speculating nearly every time and making up stories for entertainment?
He is a very learned individual who authored 100 publications. So yes, the extent of his learning is deep. And it is actually very interesting to look at his accounts of doing this for his students, because we have that, and his accounts for the public, which we also have, and then comparing it to when he's publishing in a more professional vein, medically or scientifically. He's often discussing the same things. So today we're always urged to merge our pedagogy and our research. He was doing that. So these things that he's doing in this impromptu way, he's actually doing great research on them as well.
So, Vera, I was intrigued by this thing that you mentioned briefly, and I imagine you've got a lot more on it, so I want to probe. This is the question of the debate that you implied was going on about whether it is better in a Wunderkammer to have freaks and deformed things because they're more curious, or whether it's better to have perfect examples of things. That's obviously a debate that was going on at that micro level that you cited, but is that a broader debate that people are having, and how does it play out?
It is a broader debate. I don't have as much on it as I'd like because I'm still writing the book. But it plays out in a very local context. So, for example, there's precedence for what Meyer's doing in things like collections of specimens of stones and collections of specimens of metals, where you really want to use them for the purposes of identification. So it doesn't help to have a sport of nature. You need to have your typical example if you're going to use it for identification. So that would be one place. And I would say that similar kind of identification purpose, you can also see there's a reason why he's a physician doing this and why physicians are important to this whole culture, in trying to kind of identify and easily identify materia medica. That would be another type of collection where you really don't want a strange, unusual medicine. You want your normal medicine.
Exemplary medicine.
Exemplary medicine.
Good. I have a feeling that this is a sort of very, very important pivot that you've identified, and I look forward to having more conversations about it later.
Thank you. I really appreciate how you talked about restraining the object, really liberated the viewer to experience it. What do you hope that current or future museum professionals can take away from your research?
Well, I do think that we should start to be a little bit more critical about the idea that these Kunst- und Wunderkammer displays are somehow a panacea, that somehow that liberates our curiosity or liberates our playfulness in a way, that there are ways that could get in the way of our playfulness. and to kind of think about that a little bit, and to think about other ways of cultivating engagement with the collection. And I'm hoping that by writing these stories of playfulness, and I'm not the only person in the Collective Wisdom Project who's working on playfulness. So Kelly Whitmer is another person who is studying the culture of play, especially in pedagogical collections. By telling this story of how the culture of play continued through the 18th and then on into the 19th century, we can think about other ways that we play with our collection that don't require this step back to the idealized past.
Thank you. I'm wondering what the relationship is of the role of the conservator in this. Is it something that emerged simultaneously or afterwards? And is there anything in the development that suggests that prefigures maybe another epistemic shift in the nature of curatorship, for example?
So Meyer has strong views on this question, as you could imagine. He really criticizes the way that the keeper of collections has been given to artisans, whom he says do not have the requisite philosophical underpinnings to organize or make proper use of their collection. And he says, of course, the ideal curator is the experimental natural philosopher, because they have both the philosophical viewpoint and they also have the artisanal skills. And in fact, he has a very long list of craft skills that he demands of his students. They have to learn sculpture. They have to learn how to work with metals. They have to learn how to polish glass and cabinetry. He builds his cabinetry himself. He says that it's too annoying to wait for an artisan to do it because they don't know how to build it in a new and innovative way. So he definitely has an ideal of the ideal curator. And it's a departure from the norm of his time. However, it's not really a conservator if you consider that he's also advocating destroying these objects. So along with that comes the idea that you need to have a supply chain constantly bringing you new material, and that's a difficulty for him. He has to rely on people who come from another culture of curiosity in order to get him his objects. You also might be gifted wonderful things from princes and dukes that you cannot destroy. So that's another challenge. Does that answer your question? Okay.
One would think that there'd be an innumerable number of objects that would constitute a cabinet of curiosities, but was there any kind of discipline about how this was supposed to be put together? Everybody had to have a certain number of fossils, for example, or stuffed birds or something like this. How would they be organized?
He says you can see nearly 1,000 objects at once, as though that's a lot. That's actually not a lot for a period collection. And one of the interesting things about him is that he, in fact, does argue for a restrained collection. You saw how there's only 6 people that can fit in there at a time, and that's on purpose. He wants this to be intimate. There aren't that many cabinets there. So if you compare it to some of the particularly post-30 Years' War ducal collections that are being established in the area, and these huge palaces, Baroque palaces, where you've got these galleries of collection that go on as far as the eye can see. You keep walking down the hall of the castle, and there's just one crazy beast after the other. That's what he's trying to avoid. And so he is actually urging for this particular discipline. So he doesn't want more than is useful. He wants everything to be extremely well cataloged. That's a big part of this. Is he calls it philosophical bookkeeping, this system of catalogs that will arrange everything. And not only that, you need to stay on top of all of your objects, the latest research published in journals of the period. You can't do that if your collection is too big, because you constantly need to go back to your catalog, put in all the references to what the latest experimentation has been. Perhaps they discovered this object that you thought was a turtle stone is in fact something else, and you need to move it to another cabinet. So as a curator, as a philosophical curator, you need to be very involved in the state of the art of science at the time. And you cannot have this gigantic kind of accumulatory collection that was more the norm. Yeah.
What you've shown us is the Curiosities moving to museum. What happens next? What's the next step?
We're still in it right now. I will beg off with that. I mean, I do think that I mentioned Wise's recent book just published last year, where he has 2 or 3 chapters on the role of the museum in these 19th century German research universities. And you look at the rhetoric of that, and it's actually quite similar to Meyers' rhetoric. So I do think that this pedagogical, research-oriented use of the museum was the new future. It's too bad that our administration doesn't remember it. But yes. Mm-hmm. Is there another question? Yeah, sure.
Was there like a hierarchy of how the objects were displayed within the cabinets, or like, I'm thinking at eye level, you know, maybe you're going to go towards that rather than try to get up way high or low, or how did hierarchy of objects play out?
Yeah, that's interesting. He doesn't really discuss height issues in the design of cabinets. Each of the cabinets has a different content, you know, and they're very methodically organized. And his collection, while majority natural objects, is not only natural objects. He's also got automata, he's also got some sculpture, he's got a cabinet. Actually, he's very proud of his coin collection cabinet, which he designed and built, and is very innovative, he thinks. Innovatively, he has coins not only from Greece and Rome, but from around the world, which was pretty new for his period. And he has a collection of gemstones. So it is both art and nature, and there doesn't seem to be a clear hierarchy between those two categories. But otherwise, in the realm of nature, there's an obvious hierarchy. It goes through stones into plants, into animals, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all very clearly mapped out. But not really on the shelf-by-shelf level, more cabinet to cabinet.
To the museums, and unfortunately I cannot remember, but it seems to me that I went in Berlin or Vienna to museums also of the 17th or 18th century, which were celebrating order. Mm-hmm. Like you had like thousands of bones.
Right.
And they're very systematically organized, mm-hmm. not at all in the way of curiosity.
Right.
So isn't there a counter-tradition to this at the same time?
Well,
and I think in the literature, Francis Bacon and mm-hmm. others, you know, who really are eager to find a system towards nature which is not based on a variety of objects, mm-hmm. but systematically collecting one object in its variations.
Well, you touched on my favorite subject, Francis Bacon, so I could start going on for quite a while. But I would differ with your interpretation of Bacon. I think that his view about epigenesis and variety appearing in nature is a lot more metamorphic and malleable and curious in the old sense than we often give him credit for. He's often interpreted in a far too modern lens. But I would argue that what you pointed to is exactly that huge shift that we all know happened, right? Something big changed, curiosity cabinets, to something very, very different. And precisely how that happened is what we're trying to explore. And I do think that Meyer is gesturing in that direction, that is one of the changes that he's trying to affect. In terms of what his actual influence was, because I mentioned how nobody knows him now, he's very little work done, he did have direct lines of influence into that kind of development. So for example, one of his students in Kiel went on to found a kind of ideal scientific institution in Halle, the one that my colleague I mentioned before, Kelly Whitmer, is working on, Franke, the Franke Foundation. And he has like an ideal cabinet that you can still visit today. It's actually, if I go all the way back to our kind of introductory image for this project, this is from the Halle cabinet, so you can go there and see that wonderful collection. And it seems to be directly inspired by Meyer. And it, in turn, was a kind of ideal collection that inspired a lot of other 18th century collections. So there's a genealogy one can trace there. The other thing is that Meyer was plagiarized very often. And so that's one reason why he himself is not so well known, but his ideas did spread a lot, is that they got picked up and reprinted wholesale, like the whole books, under different names. So I do think that what you're pointing to is something that he helped establish.
Hi, I was wondering the implications for collections of cultural and ethnicity and stuff.
Yes.
If it's moving in this direction, if there are guidelines, this is maybe more tangential, but you might know, for like respecting, like not being racist or something, and
Right.
but presenting, not cultural from parts of the different world.
Yeah, I will. Whoops, sorry. Oh, not everyone sees my very messy desktop. I'll show you an example. I always have some backup slides at the end of one effort to do that. So this was at UCLA 2013 to 2014. And so the idea is that this Chicana artist is going to kind of exorcise the colonialism of the modern museum by creating this new world of Wunderkammer. But the criticism here is that the Wunderkammer was also implicated in geopolitical biases and power moves. And so you don't exorcise it really by the creation of such a Wunderkammer. It doesn't, in fact, kind of establish anything that is any more necessarily respectful for those cultures than the later museum was. Yes, yes. That is what you have to do.
So we have time for one more question.
Did you ever check the etymology of the word wunder? Because it seems to me, and because we would normally think of the miraculous, the marvelous, etc.,
Right.
etc. But it seems you establish a link between the so-called marvelous and miraculous and the scientific, systematic.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion of the category of wonder, particularly in relationship with also curiosity, in history of science literature. I haven't myself written on that topic in case of wonder. But there's an obvious secularization of wonder that's going on. If you think about the fact that the main place that you would go to see jokes of nature and wonders would have been the cathedral. Prior to the establishment of you go to the cathedral, you see a crocodile hanging from the ceiling, you see elephants' tusks, you see ostrich eggs. So anything wonderful, miraculous is hung there as a part of lending to that aura of wonder. And so the process by which those kinds of objects then get moved into a culture of the cabinets of curiosity is a process of secularization.
Thank you, Dr. Keller. Please join me in thanking our speakers.